In summary, I thought that Feyerabend tackles the subject of science in an overly simplistic manner, focusing in particular on one area of science several hundred years ago. The choice of subject material means that the variable quality of evidence being used in his arguments distracts from the main discussion of a philosophy of science. Thus, challenges to a number of his arguments involve a closer look at historical events, and this reveals a great deal of uncertainty in a number of areas. I found his arguments against falsifiability and rationalism unconvincing. I thought that a number of his arguments used absolutes, whereas science in the real world operates within the bounds of probability and pragmatics. The use of probability in a pragmatic approach to science has produced useful results and mirrors expectations people have of their interactions with the external world. In other words, we get simple things right most of the time, walking, talking, eating and so on. Simple things wrong some of the time, e.g. falling, and complex things are a lot more variable. I'm going to use an analogy now. It's not a great analogy, but I thought it might be useful in reframing the discussion. When a light or light bulb is switched on, most of the time it will come on, but at some point it won't. However, when we switch a light on, we expect it to come on, and in most cases we will be right. This approach is incredibly useful in helping us to get on with our lives. The approach that Feyerabend takes in some of his arguments is much akin to focusing on the potential of the light to not come on, and basing expectations on this and generalizing the consequences to all other scenarios. Such an approach is useful in considering how to respond when the light doesn't come on, but for most of the time it's not too useful. To take the analogy further, Feyerabend might recommend gathering candles, lanterns and a variety of other methods for generating light in order to meet the eventuality of the light not working, and even using these methods simultaneously. Thus, in one room we might use a light bulb, and in another we might use a candle, and so on. However, Feyerabend has been sufficiently vague that in this analogy we do not know what alternatives we should be using, how costly it will be, where we should be using them, how often we should be using them. As for why we should be using them, all we know is that sometimes the light bulb might not work, and therefore we need to use alternatives as well. Taking this further, it's possible to see that the light bulb has become the dominant domestic light source in many nations. Should we say in a slightly light-hearted manner that the light bulb has displaced other light sources, quote, without a single glance in their direction, unquote, in an imperialistic march into the household? This, of course, would be ridiculous. If there is a demand for the light bulb or its alternatives, then the market will fill this demand soon enough. People have a choice between candles, light bulbs and their successors, and any number of alternatives. If they want to light their house with candles, they can do so. The light bulb, though, has still been dominant. It is convenient, effective, and reliable. There is a place for alternatives when an atmosphere is to be created, and these will be used occasionally. The light bulb has been adopted by large groups of people in different communities. Choices have been made, and the alternatives considered. In just the same way, scientists have presumably considered alternative careers, or may immerse themselves in the arts when outside of their scientific endeavours. People have the choice to believe in alternatives to the scientific knowledge that is provided. To believe that science can be like a fallen empire, however, is another matter. Money has been successful, and regardless of empires rising and falling, has remained. Making clothes, building shelters, creating music. These are just a few examples of activities which have persisted through empires across the world. So too has science. Science offers us the promise of a knowledge of the world around us, a knowledge that is tangible and useful to us, a knowledge that we can relate to. There may be many ways of getting to that knowledge, but common to this is a thinking, exploring community of people across the world, testing this and that, seeing what works and what doesn't. It is this network with a common aim, a plan of furthering knowledge about the world, that partly underlies this success. Perhaps the underlying methodology is still advancing as it is being tested. This network has different properties to the networks in other endeavours. Perhaps it is characterised by a willingness to readily embrace the futures of science, technology in the pursuit of its goals. Maybe in 100 years, this network will have properties far different to those of today. While this happens, people in other networks, from other traditions, observe these networks with interest, and their summated conclusions determine how science is perceived. In such paradigms, the most successful networks regard each other with mutual interest. Although I have been critical of many of Feyerabend's arguments as outlined above, I agree with some of the main values he espouses, that we should be respectful of other traditions. In the process of discussing these values, however, Feyerabend puts them squarely up against science, and here it is that I disagree fundamentally with him. In many ways I found Against Method to be a political statement, although I have read it for the purpose of gaining a better understanding of the philosophy of science. In the end, though, I was not persuaded by Feyerabend's central argument that anything goes. For me, Feyerabend would have been more successful had he demonstrated this principle with several examples from current practice. I would argue that a systematic methodology underlies an incremental progress. A multiplicity of methods satisfies the need for individual expression in scientific work, but I would argue that this is far different from the structured approach that is required at the organisational or network level, to draw on the earlier analogy. Indeed, it is the forging of global networks that is so important to the advance of scientific knowledge and the benefits for humanity.